Hello, this time I thought we could look at some of the tools and techniques we can use to maintain a high level of code quality in Project Venimus. So one of the most important things in modern software development is a CI pipeline. So this allows us to define how our code is going to be built and released. So as I mentioned last time, we're using GitHub for source control. So within the York developers organization, we've got a project for Venimus, which contains our source code. And then to do the build itself, we're using Azure DevOps. So when you hook GitHub up to Azure DevOps, it creates an integration for you with some webhooks. So that's the integration it's created, and you can see the webhooks it's generated. So this means that when code is pushed to the master branch in GitHub, it automatically triggers a build in Azure DevOps. So we have one pipeline for each project. The one we're looking at today is the APIs project. So this gets triggered when the code gets changed in GitHub. And you can see each of the times the code's been built. We're going to edit it. The build itself is defined using a YAML file, by default called Azure pipelines.yaml. And this contains the steps the build is going to go through. Because this code is written using .NET Core, we can build it either on Linux or on Windows. So I'm using Ubuntu in this case. I'm using .NET 3.1 and the latest version of that. This step means go off and build the code. The unit tests require a MongoDB database, so I create a new database here and run that in Docker, and then I can run my tests. I then work out the code coverage. I then publish the APIs as artifacts, publish any test results, and then finally, if everything's worked successfully, I can generate my Docker image. So the advantage here is you're not building the code on your own machine and then copy it onto a server. Everything's done centrally, so everybody builds the code in the same way. And this file itself is actually part of source control, so it gets checked into GitHub as well, so everyone knows exactly how the code should be built. So if we go back to the project itself, so as I mentioned before, I'm using test-driven development, so that also helps with the quality of code. So the structure I've gone for is I have one folder per API I'm testing, and then I have multiple tests for API. And then I'm using the coverlet tool to see what percentage of my code is covered by these tests. So because I'm using test-driven development, this should be a fairly high figure. You don't need to get to 100%, but probably higher than 80%. I've also hooked this up to the Azure pipeline. So once the build's completed, we look at the most recent build. We can see it also includes a code coverage tab. And you can see what percentage of our code is covered by tests. So just because you've got 100% tests, it doesn't mean the tests are any good, but it can be a good indicator of dead code. So if you find some code that's not covered by a test and you go in and look at it and you find actually that code can't be called, then maybe you can actually just delete that code from the project. Because I'm working on my own, I'm making changes directly to the master branch. However, if more people work on this project, then we'd almost certainly be using feature branches and then have a pull request for a peer review before the code gets merged into master. One of the things about these peer reviews is they should focus on improving the quality of code rather than the style. The styles such as are the spaces and brackets in the right place really should be enforced by the IDE. So the way you can do that in Visual Studio is you can install an analyzer. So I've got a couple of analyzers installed. The first one is StyleCop. So StyleCop analyzers gets its settings from a rule set file up here, and so this is shared by the whole solution. So you can see the checks that we want to enforce, such as spacing between brackets and white spaces and so on. So we can look at that in action. So we just pick a... So for example in here, if I insert a load of extra carriage returns, you can see I now get an error because my StyleCop's configured to not allow more than one blank line consecutively. So delete those again. One thing to note is by default that gives you a warning. So I've configured the project so that warnings should be treated as errors. So if you do that from the beginning, it's not too bad to keep on top of. So it means that you can't even build the code, and if you check it in, it's also going to fail the build. One thing to note is sometimes if you set this setting using the IDE, it puts in a property group which has a condition, which means it only applies to the debug or the release build. So you want to make sure by looking at the file that it actually applies to all builds. Another analyzer I'm using is the FXCOP analyzer. So StyleCop was more concerned with the style of your code, and FXCOP is a bit more concerned about what your code does. So an example of that would be if you had something like this. That gives you an error because I'm using toString, but I'm not saying what locale settings to be using, because depending on your locale, that could be converted into a different string. You can also control some of the validation by using these files called editor configs. So you can have a config file at the solution level, and you can also have one in your project level. So my solution one is saying that I can't have using directives which aren't used. So for example, if I added an extra using in here, that would be an error because I'm not using system.io anywhere in this code. So the file I've got a group at project level enforces underscores for private fields. So this means that if we added a field to here, and get it to automatically generate the field date time, you can see it uses an underscore in the front rather than this dot. So this makes sure that everybody who's contributing to this project is doing it in a consistent way, otherwise the code just doesn't build. Just save that. Another thing is to try and keep the sort of structure of the code as simple as possible as well. So I split things down by folders. So I have my controllers in my controllers folder. Everything to do with MongoDB is in the Mongo folder. So that's all the queries against the Mongo database, and these are the models. So I use the term models to represent classes of data which we've retrieved from the database, possibly writing back to the database. And I use view models for anything which is going to talk to the outside world. So in these cases, these view models are returned by API calls. I would never pass a model directly out of an API. If you look at a controller, I tend to put logic itself within a controller method unless it gets too complicated. I don't bother moving this into a separate services layer because it tends to be just simple enough to keep it in one place. I also try and avoid using interfaces unless I've got multiple implementations of a class. In this case here, I've got an interface for mass transit. Because we're using .NET Core, it means dependency injection is very good. So a lot of things get injected in either at the constructor level, or you can also inject on an individual method. So if a service is only going to be used by one method in the controller, I would consider doing it at method level. So the dependency injection, if you haven't seen it before, is set up in the startup class. And these are all the services which can then be injected. So as you can see, I'm not using interfaces. So when you ask for something like group store, it just provides the group store class. The other trick I'm using is to help sort of reduce complexity in the code. Internally, we're using a service bus, so we're using a mass transit. So this helps decouple various areas of the code. So a good example of that would be when a user amends their details. We update the user's details in the MongoDB database, and then we publish a message saying their details have changed. A consumer, which is separate to this code, then receives that message and then goes off and updates the user details in any groups they belong to and any events they've registered to attend. So the idea is we're keeping this logic separate from the actual controller itself, which changes the data. Thank you.